I'm Amanda Lindahl, and I'm a volunteer at the farm school. And we are just so excited to have Aubrey share with us today. So Aubrey is a writer, teacher, and researcher who studies stories of relationships between humans and plants. She directs the Ecosphere Studies program at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, where she leads civic science communities that bring together researchers and a range of people around the U.S. to grow and observe new perennial grain crops. So these civic science projects involve collecting agroecological data and learning through people's stories, images, and experiences. She grew up in a small town in Kansas where her parents farm wheat and raise cattle, and she loves limestone soils and rocky prairie hillsides. So she holds a PhD in English and Great Plains Studies from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and is a co-author of the collaborative textbook, The Omaha Language and the Omaha Way. So thanks, Aubrey, and I'll go ahead and let you have it.
I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for being here with me today. Thanks to you, the organizers of the conference and the participants in it. And of course, thanks to all of our colleagues and collaborators, including the plants and animals, the rocks and soils, and the waters and airs. And if you aren't familiar with that word in my title, ecosphere, that's what ecosphere means, all these different spheres of life on this planet that we're embedded in and dependent upon. So we give gratitude for them as we start today. And the other part of my title, the studies part, is just an indication of the importance of learning. And that's a lot of what I do as a student and try to foster as a teacher and researcher in these learning communities. So I'm really excited to share with you today about that work and invite you a little bit into our story here at the Land Institute. And I am here in Salina, Kansas, speaking with you, and I want to welcome you to Salina, and I'm going to do that by sharing what I hope works is a video. Let's see if I can make this work. I'm going to make it nice and big for you. Here we go. So welcome to Wahab Prairie Overlook. This is a little prairie remnant, mixed grass prairie on a hilltop at the Land Institute's main campus on Waterwell Road, just south of Salina. And this prairie remnant is an important part of our work because native, perennial, diverse, healthy ecosystems inspire the agroecosystems that we're trying to build. So if you were with me at the Land Institute, this is the walk that we would be taking. We're gonna move slowly down this hillside here into our research plots. And as we go, you can notice some wonderful native perennial species. We just passed a lead plant there. You can see yucca is around us. Some of these plants have been visited and known by many peoples over time. Native peoples have ongoing relationships with these plants. And I think it's important for us to recognize and listen and honor and respect those relationships, and as best as we can, or us collectively, to restore them. So being grounded in this place and recognizing how rare these prairie remnants are, especially in mixed grass and tall grass prairie country, it's really, really valuable for us to visit them and be inspired by them. So as we are turning down towards the hillside here, you can see in the foreground, we're going down, we're in the watershed of the Smoky Hill River. So as we make the turn, that's the river that's behind those trees. And as we move down, you can start to see agriculture taking place. So this prairie hilltop was not plowed. Historically, we know it was grazed, and we manage it now with burning. But the rockiness of it and the steepness preserved it from being plowed. But as we go down into the bottomland, into the flatland, it has been brought under production and has been tilled. And the influence and impact of that tillage has been harsh on the soil communities, on the plant communities, and on the sustainability of the ecosystem in terms of its ability to persist for the long term. So recognizing those harms and the difficulty of sustaining productive agriculture for a long time because of the damage is something that we're paying attention to. And as we turn the corner here, what you'll see are the Land Institute's research plots in our work to create new perennial grain crops, unlike annuals that have to be replanted every year and that thus require tillage and disturbance of the soil system. Perennials hold on to soil, put down those deep roots, and we are working to create perennial versions of grain crops, the crops that feed so many people on this planet. So we're going to move forward into a field of Thinopyrum intermedium, or Kernza perennial grain. So this is a breeding plot, a nursery that's all Kernza, and this video was taken at the beginning of July. Kernza in Kansas is harvested in late July. So you're seeing the full seed heads here and seeing the promise that they hold. Kernza is being grown across the US in a very small way right now as we're continuing R&D and is being moved into a variety of food products in the supply chain as we start to build those as well. So I'm going to switch back to some slides to bring you back into the story of the Land Institute. And I wanted to say that this is also for me a personal story. As Amanda mentioned, I grew up in a really small town in Kansas. My parents are farmers and ranchers. And this field that we're looking at, an annual wheat field, this monoculture, this is right after wheat harvest. This is a really normal sight to me. It's really natural. It's really beautiful. This is the annual grain crop that's fed me and that feeds so many people. But I also grew up recognizing and learning more and more that this farming system for grains is really precarious, not something I can depend upon. It requires a lot of inputs. It doesn't sustain soil for the long term. And the farming system and economic system that it's interconnected with is also precarious for the livelihood of farmers and rural communities. So when I was in graduate school, I started to learn more about the layers of this landscape. Growing up, I primarily looked at the community that I knew of, immigrant farmers who had come from Europe and who were settling this place. And in graduate school, I had the opportunity to learn more about Indigenous relationships with their homelands upon which we live and inhabit. So this is a painting by a Kansas artist, Shinhee Chin, People of the Wind, that is about the Kansas or Kaw people who our state is named for, and learning about this, not only history, but these ongoing continuing relationships to the land, learning and studying a native language has been really important for me to start to see and understand this place better. And as I started to re-see the land and learn more about it, I started to also re-see the prairie for the first time. So this is a pasture that my family has cattle on. And just like the wheat field, I grew up thinking of it as sort of natural and normal, but didn't really understand it, or I wasn't really able to see it. And when I started to actually look again, I started to see the perenniality and diversity of this place. Of course, many people are helping inform that knowledge, and paying attention to how an ecosystem like this that's healthy has lasted and been productive both for a really long time. So starting to see the prairie, including there aren't animals in this picture, there aren't native peoples in this picture in their homelands, but being able to start to see this helped me unlearn a little bit of our current grain agricultural system as being normal or natural. Here is an example of a different, more persistent ecosystem. So I started to become challenged to let go of what I thought I knew about how the way the world had to be, what was inevitable, and start to open up imaginatively more to the possibility of building something new and better and more inclusive and equitable. So this prairie has really been a kind of portal for me into these ideas. And once I was able to sort of grasp what perenniality and diversity could mean for plants, for people, for landscapes, I could start to glimpse a more viable future for myself, for people and community, and for this land. And that possibility, once I could see it, I really couldn't unsee it. And so I'm really grateful to the Land Institute for being a community and space that opens up that possibility for us. The best way that I've found to kind of talk about this experience of learning, of both unlearning what I thought I knew and also beginning to learn something new, has been with this idea of a threshold. Threshold is an entry point. It's a doorway. It comes from the word to thresh, to separate the grain from the stalks and chaff. A threshold, the definition is literally the sill under the door that contains the thresh within the domicile or the home. So people step on it with their feet, just like you step on plants to beat the grain from the straw. So threshold reminds us of threshing, which is important for grain agriculture. But there's also this pathway in research that's really interesting. It's a framework that grows out of educational research that explores this idea of threshold concepts. And the source I've cited below, Meyer and Land, is the key one here. And what they mean by threshold concepts are basically ways to name the things that you must know in order to participate in a kind of research community. There are ways to name the entry points that you must pass through, the way that you're thinking or feeling or behaving must be transformed or changed. And they really note that threshold concepts come at a cost. They're not easy to achieve. They take a real journey to get through the other side. And you have to let go of things and unlearn or let go of what you thought you knew to get through to that new place. So they use these words to describe threshold concepts about transformative. They really do holistically change things. Integrative, they bring things together that you weren't putting together before. Irreversible, once you go through, you can't go back or don't want to go back. And troublesome because of this tricky nature. They're not easy to pass through a threshold. So this idea of crossing the threshold into a different type of agriculture has been a really useful way for me to think about the kind of transition that our agricultural systems can go through. And perenniality and diversity as threshold concepts have been really helpful touchstones for me. And they, of course, are core to the work of the Land Institute in Grain. So just to illustrate them a little bit here, this is a biculture of Kernza perennial grain with another perennial legume, alfalfa. And I like this image because it starts to give us a glimpse of what could be on the other side of that doorway if we can start to step through it. A kind of agricultural system that can persist and that can feed people. So the perennial grain crops and cropping systems that we're working on, including Kernza, are about creating ecosystem services that have been lost in our current agricultural system. So the way that grain agriculture works now has all sorts of not good ecological impacts, and by being able to move more in a direction that values and that foregrounds perennial plants grown in high diversity agroecosystems, we can regain and restore some of those ecosystem services. And then, of course, agriculture is about people. Grains are staple foods, as we know, and they are about nourishing people in communities. So people are the ones who do agriculture. We are part of agricultural systems, and feeding people is the point of agriculture. So this is the staff of the Land Institute at our home campus here in Kansas. And I wanted to show you some of the kind of cast of characters of this work of our research community on site. And we're working, like I said, on a variety of perennial grain crops and cropping systems. So we have ecologists and crop stewardship. So we're thinking about supply chains and moving perennial grain crops onto landscapes. And then the area that I work in and I'll be talking about is this learning communities work that we do in Ecosphere Studies. So we have collaborators at the Land Institute around the world in a range of communities, but today I wanted to talk specifically about some of the communities we're building in the US, the civic science communities that Amanda mentioned in the introduction. So the key character in the story I'm going to tell is a native prairie perennial plant, Silphium integrifolium, which you might know by the name of rosin weed. There are many very charismatic species in the Silphium genus. You might know compass plant or others, and they're sort of relatives of sunflowers, and they have these blossoms that look sort of sunflower-esque. This particular Silphium species has been noted by past prairie ecologists like John Weaver, and this quotation is from a current ecologist who works for the Nature Conservancy, noting the sort of drought resistance of this particular Silphium integrifolium species. And I wanted to note that I didn't point out when we were on the prairie walk at the beginning, but we passed by some native wild Silphium right in that prairie remnant at the Land Institute. So what is happening above ground is really exciting with Silphium. What's happening below ground, though, is where that drought tolerance comes from, this incredible root system. And you can see some of this illustrated in these Silphium plants right here. So here's sort of where the plot starts of the story. My colleague, David Van Tassel, who's a botanist, and he's the lead researcher for the Land Institute's Perennial Oilseeds Domestication Program, has been looking at Silphium and working with Silphium as a domestication candidate. So just like sunflower, we would use this perennial plant as an oilseed crop. And in this species, he has been dealing with some different pest and pathogen issues. So they're needing to learn, he and our ecological colleagues are trying to learn what insects and diseases are affecting Silphium, because we are working to domesticate Silphium within its native home range, since it's a plant native to Kansas and we're in Kansas. So all these species that have co-evolved with Silphium are present here too. And their team was realizing that they needed multiple environments where plants can be grown for multiple years, and they needed to collect lots of different types of biological and ecological data. So we needed an affordable way to grow Silphium in many more places so we could start to understand how to domesticate it more effectively. And meanwhile, on the other side of campus, I'm working on the human side of things, and I was sort of facing a different problem. As an educational researcher and educator, I was working on things like workshops and doing lots of experiential learning activities to engage communities like this visiting class of little kids on campus. But I was facing the problem of transfer, which is about making learning deep and lasting. So people can visit the prairie with me for an afternoon or a day, or they can come to our prairie festival. But to really learn, you need sort of deep and repeated and ongoing experiences, and you need actual relationships. So working with Indigenous communities on language revitalization really reminded me of how important and transformative the kind of daily work of caring for plants and people and places is. So I needed some way to get not only people to come to us to see perennials, but to get perennials out to people, so that people could connect with them on a much more regular daily basis. So David and I clearly started to need each other, and we were inspired by a colleague and collaborator of mine, an artist who's pictured at left here. Her name is Carmen Moreno, and she gave me the inspiring suggestion of thinking about a civic science approach, and she's been working with this approach in her own work. So in a civic science approach, people are involved in communities of learning. And you might be familiar with the kind of citizen science approach where people, one time collect data and send it in, and then the scientist gets all sorts of crowdsourced data and they have a big data set to work with. And civic science is sort of like that. People submit data, but rather than just one time and they don't have any connection to other participants in the project or to the scientist, civic science is about kind of fostering the community aspect of this, and getting people involved as sort of co-researchers and having them persist over time. So it's a way of realizing that we need each other and to be able to accomplish our goals, both biologically and ecologically, but also socially and culturally. So if we wanted to create this perennial future, we needed, as you can see here, broad participation in these domestication processes, and we need people to learn how to care for perennial crops and process and to do it together. So these civic science communities we've been building are designed to gather data across multiple locations and to broaden and sustain public participation in learning. So the way we think about this is in a paper that our team recently published, which is about understanding how domestication involves genetic changes to plants. It also involves agronomic knowledge about how to farm and care for and grow these plants effectively. And it involves cultural changes. So this is a figure from this paper, just recognizing that domestication processes involve people and plants together. And in academic terms, this is sort of identified in a transdisciplinary research context. And what transdisciplinary means is basically that we're putting the natural and social sciences together in the context of arts and humanities. And so we're bridging different disciplines, but we're also sort of going beyond them. That's the trans part, going beyond them to engage real people and regular communities in their everyday lives in this kind of research process. So in the next few moments, I just want to briefly touch on the kind of pilot projects that we did. We started an actual pilot project back in the summer of 2019, and we were really excited that people, our friends and colleagues, were interested in participating. So we got more than 40 people around the US to grow silphium seedlings that we sent to them. And we were really just trying this as an experiment and inviting people to learn with us, as we had never done anything like this before. So we didn't know whether people would get excited or not, or persist or not. But they did. They planted their plants. This one on the left is actual silphium that was planted in a community garden in Kansas City. The one picture on the right is, I think, from the Northeast. People were really excited to tend to their plants, and they were sharing that back with us. And meanwhile, I involved my son too in our pilot project, just to make sure that we were doing some intergenerational work. So we now have, if you're interested in reading more about this, I'll just mention we have a webpage on the Land Institute's website that talks more about our work as well. And what civic science means is really about bringing these communities together to grow and observe and care for and study these perennial crops. So in our pilot community, we now have people in their second year, have just finished their second growing season, growing silphium. And we also, in 2020, launched a second silphium cohort focused particularly on diversity within the silphium species, within Silphium integrifolium, the sort of creation of ecotypes from wild seed that we had gathered, and having people around the country plant these different ecotypes so that we could conserve that diversity and also start to grow seed accessibility for restoration and for research. So across, this is the ecotype conservation pilot locations too, so around the US. And we started to build new educational materials. So we started to create models of silphium phenology so that people each month, as they fill out their surveys, can track what stage of growth their silphium is at different places. People are growing this species in places where it hasn't been grown before in the US. And so we are really interested in understanding when does it flower? When does it reach these different stages of maturity? And we're also really interested in understanding from a citizen science perspective, how people persist. So in the literature, we've learned that there aren't very many long-term studies, and we're really interested in developing strategies to help people stay engaged in these type of projects. And again, people seem to be really enthusiastic about exercising and expressing their own creativity. So we had participants do things like this participant make their own homemade signage for their plot, to talk to their community, their friends and family and neighbors about it. And people reported in surveys that they regularly were talking to people they know about what they were doing in their garden and why. We also created a sort of framework to be able to start to study what sort of engagement materials are the most useful, what sort of outcomes they lead to, and how people can persist over time. And in our pilot study, in which we just finished the second season, at the beginning of this season, we asked people why did they return? How were they perennial, just like these perennial plants? What brought them back? And many of them said it was actually seeing their silphium reemerge, as well as their own inner motivation and sense of commitment that really brought them back to this project. So silphium doesn't bloom until the second year. And so this year in our pilot cohort, once we had those blooms, we were able to start to understand some of the different pollinator interactions. We created new guides around pests like Eucosma. We started to be able to look at some potential evidence of pathogens on silphium. Silphium is a pollinator magnet, so we were really excited for people to do insect observations and report those to us. You can see some great photos. We had a photo contest and people were able to document what insects they saw on their plants. And we also looked specifically at rust, which is an issue with silphium. So people did observations. And we are learning so many things, including about all sorts of potential issues, as well as beneficial ecological interactions. And we're really learning how to collect sort of quantitative data, these sort of measurements, as well as sort of qualitative data, people's stories and experiences and photographs. So we're in these early stages, and we just finished sort of the silphium harvest. You can see people are sending in Ziploc bags from their silphium plants in their backyard. We're also learning about the ethnobotanical relationships that silphium has. So because it's a native prairie species, indigenous peoples do know silphium integravolium. And this is something we're in the very early stages of learning about, but it's really important to recognize. And we're excited to start to hopefully build more connections in this area. And of course, that's a really humbling process. And I want to emphasize that. So I just wanted to wrap up by saying this is a valuable approach that we think that brings many things together to meet all sorts of goals that would help address the kind of grand challenges that we face in our agricultural system. And we'll see evidence, hopefully, of the effects of that both above ground and below ground for people and for plants. And recognizing that this sort of work, the civic science imperative, as this particular article points out, is not easy, because learning has to be an ongoing process. It has to be based upon processes that are mutually beneficial to everyone. So we are very much in the experimental learning phase, and we're really lucky to be learning with the people that we do. And I wanted just to point out that this work of care, of community building, of tending, for me has really been inspired by a lot of movement organizers, especially from disability justice work. So this value of accessibility and recognizing and honoring the people who have been teachers in this matters a lot, I think, as we go about the work of building communities. So this is the current pilot civic science communities that we have. We have two with silphium that I've talked about. We also have a pilot with another one of our species, a perennial legume called sainfoin. And maybe just as a last word, I'll give the closing shot to one of our participants who told us in a Facebook post recently that he was so impressed with how resilient his silphium was. He had to relocate it a couple of different times. He was so excited to see it coming back up. But the video that he shared with us was actually of him and his kids going out and playing a kind of hide and seek game, trying to find where the silphium was coming back up, finding the white tags and identifying it. And when they were filming the video, his kids explained that they were pretending to be the Land Institute. They were being scientists, and they weren't just pretending, I think. They actually were. They were actually performing what civic scientists do. They were out collecting data, making relationships, caring for these plants. And that sort of community building and sharing, I think, is really important and inspiring as we think about moving forward into a new agricultural future. So thank you very much for being with me today. I'm happy to have conversation and answer questions.
Thanks, Aubrey. That was awesome. as you mentioned, now we have time for questions. If folks have any, they can put them into the chat box or the Q&A down there. But Dawn mentioned that, you know, we'd love to have this type of project at the farm school. So are you still having more folks sign on to be these sort of civic science researchers, or is this going to be, will there be more opportunities in the future to be a part of it?
Thanks for your interest and enthusiasm. Yes, we do hope there will be opportunities in the future. Right now, because of the sort of small scale pilots, we're sort of at capacity with how many people we can care for, but we are pursuing some different opportunities that would help us scale this work. We would like to grow much larger and much more inclusive civic science community. So we're sort of putting the plans in place to hopefully be able to start building those. Because actually doing much more robust data collection across many more sites with many more people will help us learn the best together. So we don't have any openings right now. We keep a wait list and we'd love to add you to it. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested, and we can notify you as soon as we have that possibility.
Great. Do others have questions? Maybe, would you mind sharing just a little bit more about the Kernza grain and how you have, like, how is that spread as far as its, research and the way that it has been grown in different locations as well, in a similar fashion, or share a little bit more about that?
I would be happy to. And I just pulled up the kernza.org website. So I would, if anyone is interested in learning more about all things Kernza, this is the central clearinghouse and community gathering space for that. Kernza, this perennial grain, we are in the process of building and sustaining as we hopefully start moving it onto more landscapes. Right now, I'm trying to think how many, the website probably actually says exactly how many acres it's grown on across the US, but it is starting to be used in food and can be farmed, as you can see here, at larger production scales. So we're really excited about that. And this is another good example of just understanding all the different aspects of domestication. So this particular grass was brought to the US in the early part of the 20th century as a forage crop and has been grazed effectively for a long time. And then noticing the size of the seeds and doing some preliminary understanding of how tasty they were, breeders begin to be interested in this and have begun doing domestication work to increase the seed size and to start to pay attention to the nutritional profile and things like that, while of course retaining the perenniality in those deep roots. So now we are involved in that sort of breeding and genetic work, but we're also doing this agronomic work of learning how to grow it, because people haven't grown it in this way before, and learning how it might be used in dual use systems. So you could get grain as well as graze cattle on it. And then doing the cultural work of thinking about how do we learn to bake and cook with this? What does that mean and look like? So this winter or this summer was the first time that we had a company had available Kernza perennial grain flour and whole grain available for purchase. And one of the things we did there was run a citizen science project where people who purchase it, and that's an ongoing available thing, people who purchased it got a postcard with a survey that asked them to share their experience of cooking or baking with Kernza and to tell us about how the flour performed or what the taste was like, so that we can start to create a community of eaters for this crop as well. So that's another good example of the beginnings of a kind of civic science community and of the kind of long-term work of domesticating a new perennial grain.
Awesome. It's delicious, you guys. I was able to purchase some of the grains and the flour, and it's so nutty. And when you bake with it, it sort of smells like it's like cinnamon, nutmeg almost coming out of the oven, even though it's, when I baked with it, it was just plain Kernza bread. So anyways, definitely recommend that to our folks in attendance. If you haven't tried it yet, it is, you can order it online and it's delicious. Don added in here, is it friendly to native grasses, plants?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that people often ask about with the creation of new crops is, how are they going to do in the context of native ecosystems? And so I think, this is where the history of Kernza as the introduced forage species is really helpful to know that this plant does not sort of escape and become invasive. It doesn't pose a threat in that way. It's already been introduced and there hasn't been issues with spread. And so in that way, I think that we can have some degree of confidence. And that's an important thing to be thinking about for all of the crops that we work with.
What are you most looking forward to in the coming year in your work at the Land Institute?
That's a great question. There are definitely some projects in the works that I wish that we were at launch stage and I could tell you all about, but we're working behind the scenes to get to launch on. So a few things like that come to mind. But I'm especially excited about this sort of possibility of scaling and growing our work. One way to understand the Land Institute is to think about how we're more than 40 years old as an organization. We were founded in 1976, and there was a whole sort of phase of questioning whether a perennial grain crop was possible. And then with Kernza, we've sort of accomplished proof of concept that this is possible. And now we are at the stage of growing and scaling that work with this crop and with many more crops, potential perennial grains around the world, as well as in the United States. So being at this sort of the cusp of from the proof of concept to the scaling work feels really exciting. And that's also where we are with these civic science communities. Over the last year, we've sort of learned like, oh, we can do this and it has good results at the small scale, but to really get the learning outcomes and data that will most advance these domestication projects, we really need to grow and build them. And so it feels really exciting to be sort of in the experimental design phase and the strategic planning phase of figuring that out.
Excellent. I don't see any other questions, but so thank you so much, Aubrey, for sharing. And we just want to make sure folks know that you can see on the screen right now, her contact info. And of course, the Land Institute is on all of the social media available out there. So be sure to follow them and learn more about what's going on over there. And just thanks everybody for tuning in. Thank you so much, Aubrey, for sharing. And yeah, have a great rest of your evening. There's a couple more of these webinars coming up next, so we hope folks can join those as well. But thanks, Aubrey. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thanks for everybody for participating.
Thank you all so much. It's really an honor to be with you. Thanks, Amanda, for facilitating.